Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of GaudiumSpace22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube video. Very excited today to be joined by not just a former student of mine, but a friend and now a scholar in her own right. Dr. Rachel Coleman, who is assistant professor of theology at Assumption University in Massachusetts. So, welcome, Rachel.
Thank you.
And regular viewers of my show will recognize the maladroit misanthrope that sits on the screen here, Dr. Rodney Howsare. I shamelessly stole that from you. Rodney always called me the maladroit misanthrope, which is actually more apt. Rodney is neither maladroit nor a misanthrope, but I love the alliteration and I love poking fun at him. So, dear friend, soon to be a faculty member at St. John Vianney Regional Seminary in
Vincent DePaul.
Oh, Vincent DePaul.
Yeah.
I always, John Vianney's a different seminary, and I interviewed some people from there.
That one's in Colorado.
Yes, exactly. That was Father John Nepple that I just interviewed. And,
Yeah, he's a friend too.
yeah, he is out there. That's right. You know him. And Rodney knows him too. So at any rate, you'll soon be down to the Vincent DePaul in Boynton Beach, Florida. And did they get snow by any chance last week?
During the big far down. I sent my sister-in-law a picture of my dash and it said -1. And she's super annoying and she sent hers back and it said 71.
Yeah. Jerks.
Like,
Yeah. I still remember the year though, because this does happen in northern Florida. The year my parents loved Disney World. Of course, I think Disney World is the Antichrist, but my parents loved Disney World and they would go down there every year. And they would go in the wintertime. And of course, those who know me know I'm from Nebraska. So they would go in the wintertime, to get warm weather. So there was a January where they went down to Orlando and they were there a week. And every single day in Orlando was colder than it was in Nebraska that week. It was one of those polar vortex things that came down in the north. So they had to go out and buy winter coats and crap. Meanwhile, back in Lincoln, Nebraska, they were having some stupid, heat wave in the middle of January. It was 70 degrees or something. So take that, Pinocchio, you lying bastard. Yeah. Hey, does that small world ride still exist? I always told my students that I was going to, well, I shouldn't say this because it'll get off YouTube, so I can't say it. But anyway, I was going to do bad. Not good things there. Anyway, so enough of that about Ditney World. Okay, so we're here to talk about Dr. Coleman, Rachel's article in one of the issues. Which issue of the new Ressourcement was it?
Fall 2024.
Fall 2024. Here it is. Wonderful new journal put out by Word on Fire, the new Ressourcement. And the title of the article, this is nothing to be sneezed at here. How is it with the nothing, in quotation marks? How is it with the nothing? Ferdinand Ulrich's Thomistic response to Heidegger. And it's a rather dense article, but it's a wonderful article. People should know that Dr. Coleman did her dissertation on Ferdinand Ulrich. And so before we get into the particulars of this article, which is quite good, perhaps you could tell the viewers who was Ferdinand Ulrich and why should we care about Ferdinand Ulrich? Because I care about Ferdinand Ulrich very much, even though I find him extremely difficult to read. I remember one time, Rodney, you and I were in Washington, and we'll get to your article in a second, Rachel, so hang on. This is all about me, after all. This is what happens when you do podcasts with a friend. Rachel was a former student as well at the Sales University, but you and I were down in Washington, D.C. at some conference, ACT or something. Ken Schmitz was still alive, and we had gone to Newman Bookstore or something or other. We were all proudly showing Ken in the hallway of that Franciscan place we were staying, all the books we had bought, and he was joking with us. But I had bought in German Homo Abyssus, and I thought, well, this is going to be a perfect opportunity for me to hone up my German skills. I mean, because after all, at one time I could read German, and Balthazar's German
You wrote your
wasn't exact.
dissertation on Balthazar.
That's
Yeah.
that's right. And Ed Oakes, God bless his soul, I wanted to write on only what had been translated. He goes, no, you're not going to do that. Of course, Ed was fluent in German. So I started to read Homo Abyssus in German, and I think it took me 25 years to translate a paragraph, which is why I decided, I think I'm going to wait for a competent person to come out and translate it. So the point being, yes, Ferdinand Ulrich is one of these philosophers that really wrote in very, very dense language. It makes him difficult to understand. But that's why, Rachel, I want you to introduce him to the viewers, because I actually do, all joking aside, I think he's a very important thinker. Obviously, you do too.
Yeah. So Ulrich is a 20th century philosopher. He actually, I think he died in February of 2020. So I was lucky enough that he was still alive when I was writing on him. And he actually read my dissertation, which was pretty cool.
I didn't know that. That is very cool.
Yeah.
That's very cool.
He sent me a couple of letters. We had some correspondence.
But I got to stop you there for a second, though. I mean, wasn't that kind of intimidating? Rodney, what would you think if someone, if Goronsky, your director, and Ulrich said, we're going to send the manuscripts of your dissertation to Hans Urs von Balthasar if he had been still alive? I think I would have quit my academic career on the spot. But no, absolutely not. No way.
Well,
anyway,
I mean,
go ahead.
The funny thing, so I wrote the first ever English dissertation on Ulrich. There had been like 2 or 3 previous ones in English. And so writing on him was a funny thing because there's not a ton. I mean, the literature we say is growing now, the body of literature on him, but it was just kind of for the most part, it was just like me and Ulrich, basically, and which, and on the one hand is a real pleasure to not have to necessarily be concerned with all of this secondary literature. On the other hand, it's a little bit terrifying because I was kind of like, well, this is like all on me and just what I think. And, I had some good people around me, including Eric van Versendaal, who also was writing on Ulrich at the same time. But yeah, and then sending my dissertation to him, I don't know, I guess because I was already used to just saying what I thought about him and having no kind of checks. It was a little bit less intimidating. Luckily, he thought well of it. So,
well, that's good.
He's a 20th century. Sorry, yeah, he's a 20th century German philosopher, and he was both influenced and very much influenced by Hans Urs von Balthasar, which is sort of how I discovered him, his connection to what we may call the Communio school theology. And his book, Homo Abyssus, that you just referenced, Larry, was his habilitation, which is like basically in the European system, you almost have to write a second dissertation. And his habil, as they shorten it, it's a book of what he calls both metaphysics and meta-anthropology. And so if metaphysics is the study of being as being, and asking about kind of the deep structures of reality, why things are the way they are, where do they come from, what are their purposes, right? Then the second half of the book is all about meta-anthropology and asking those same questions about human being, specifically. His work is very dense, as you alluded to, and I was just at the new Ressourcement conference in November, and Bishop Barron would not stop giving me a hard time about how dense Ulrich's language is. But as I tried to impress upon Bishop Barron, amongst others, I don't think it's I don't think it's at all to kind of show off his own erudition or knowledge. It's rather when he quotes this, and he quotes this right at the beginning of Homobusiness. In fact, there's a line from Thomas Aquinas about, if we at the beginning of something, if we are even a little bit wrong, right? An error right at the beginning, a small error right at the beginning takes us in a completely wrong direction eventually. And so I think that Ulrich, there's a reason he quotes that right at the beginning of Homo Abyssus, and it's because he sees that when talking about being, it's so important to talk about it accurately and correctly, even if in the moment it seems very abstract or abstruse. If you're not speaking about it correctly, it ends up taking you on all of these crazy paths and errors. The last thing I'll just say by way of introduction is Balthasar, who is in large part responsible for a lot of Ulrich's works being published. Balthasar once wrote about Ulrich that he is probably the most important philosopher of the 20th century, because, as Balthasar writes, he overcomes the baneful dualism that had been placed between theology and philosophy in sort of modern philosophy, basically. And I think what Balthasar is getting at there is Ulrich is a philosopher. His approach to thinking is philosophical, but he doesn't arbitrarily cut off sources of revelation to make it seem more philosophical. In fact, I think Ulrich's contention is that if we pay attention to the world well enough, it leads us to understanding God. And he's not alone in that. I think Plato thought that as well. But in modern philosophy in particular, there's a lot of the undercurrent is that you have to excise the question of God in order for this to be properly philosophical. And Ulrich just does not accept that framework at all. And that's one of the reasons I think that Balthasar thinks his work is so important for us.
Very, very good. And what other than that idea that, the closing the divide between philosophy and theology, which, in many ways, Ulrich is not the only person who had that. I remember reading Jacques Maritain's Degrees of Knowledge way back as an undergraduate, which is a Lifetime Achievement Award book if you read the thing. And Maritain made a very similar point, that reason is completed in charity, therefore philosophy is completed in theology in a lot of ways. So I guess I'm not challenging what you just said. I agree completely. Balthasar did say that, and he did think that of Ulrich. You're absolutely correct. But I think there are probably deeper metaphysical issues,
sure,
that Balthasar had, and that he thought Ulrich answered, or at least addressed, and and I know Balthasar was also very influenced by Howsare. Speaking of Howsare, by the way, a great book.
That's his new book.
No, Betts' new. I thought I had it sitting here next to me. It's actually downstairs on my reading stand next to my lazy man chair. Yeah, Betts' new book on Christology, that it leans heavily on Howsare. So anyway, you get where I'm going with this question.
Yeah.
And Rodney, you can jump in at any time. Go ahead, and then we'll get to your article because
Sure.
But I want to set this up.
Well, actually, I think that's a good segue to my article because I'm a little bit biased because this is a bit what I concentrated on, and what I continue to concentrate on in Ulrich. So you might get a different answer from other Ulrich scholars, the three of us that exist. I think that this, at least in Homo Abyssus, but I see this in all of his other works. So like all these blue books are all of Ulrich's works in my office here. The central insight that Ulrich has, and I think that he builds his metaphysics off of, is Thomas Aquinas's insistence that that essay or being, right, is complete and simple, yet non-subsistent, right? What does it mean that created being is complete and simple yet non-subsistent? Thomas writes this in De Potentia 1:1. And in addition to that, in addition to that phrase, that being is complete and simple yet non-subsistent, Ulrich also takes essentially as axiomatic Thomas's assertion that created being is the image of divinity, right, of the divine being or divine perfection. And so if you put those two things together, right, that created being is complete and simple yet non-subsistent, right, and also that it's the image, right, of the divine goodness, then that then leads you to kind of think about the metaphysical structure of reality, right, in a particular way, which is ultimately that being is a gift from God, right? And it's not just a gift that has nothing to do with God, but it's a gift that like images God. And therefore, if we pay attention closely enough to the structures of being and to how being works, so to speak, right? Then that sort of leads us to understanding, right, something about God, but then also something about human being itself, right? And so if being is complete and simple yet non-subsistent, right, it means that God has decided to create the world through this kind of fullness, right, that he holds nothing back from. Now, the created being isn't subsistent, right? God is the only complete and simple subsistence. But because God has created, right, through being, then it shows us something about the giver, right? And I mean, that's the kind of central insight, putting those two together and kind of building a metaphysics off of that. Now, in Homo Abyssus, Ulrich does this strictly sort of in the metaphysical sphere, and then what he calls the meta-anthropological sphere, right? What if being is complete and simple yet non-subsistent, and also the image of the divine goodness? What does that mean for our metaphysics? What does that mean for the structure of human being? But then he sort of takes that insight from Homo Abyssus and all the work that he does in that 600-page book, and then applies it to different aspects of the human experience. So he has a book called Logotokos, right? So that the human being is the bearer of the word, right? What does it mean that the human being is the bearer of the word? He has a book on prayer. So if the structure of being is, as I said, complete and simple yet non-subsistent, what does it mean for our prayer? He has a book on childhood. And he also even has a book on fairy tales and like interpreting fairy tales and understanding what fairy tales are. But it's all in light of this kind of central insight about being complete and simple yet non-subsistent. I mean, another way to even make that even smaller is that being is gift.
Being is gift. It reminds me, and Rodney, you can ask a question here in a second, but it does remind me of a line from Balthasar's book, Heart of the World, which is a very lyrical and poetic book, where he says that we are like God precisely in the fact that we are not God.
Yes.
And that's not an anthem of, I spit at thee, sort of, independence from God. It's that we are gifted real being.
Well, and that gets at one of the themes that Ulrich unpacks throughout Homo Abyssus is to be given being, on the one hand, it could be seen as the greatest gift of all, right? Which of course is, I think, how we're supposed to receive it and understand it. But on the other hand, to be given it means that you are not your own source of being. And that causes a lot of issues for a lot of people, right? To not be one's own source. And that's both true existentially, but also true sort of theoretically. And one of Ulrich's insights is that I think he thinks a lot of philosophers are trying to kind of philosophize their way out of reception of the gift of being, right? That they want to somehow like assert control over the source of their own being. But once we try and do that, right, we get reality wrong. And so reality becomes very obscure to us. It becomes an obscure picture. Whereas if we see that the key is to receive, right, but that reception, right, makes us like God, as you know, to use what you just quoted from Balthasar, that then sort of opens up reality for us so that we can see it so much more clearly and so much more deeply.
Excellent. That's really, and see, I knew that if I just teased it, there'd be even more. Rodney, you have a question?
I do. And this will get us kind of into the heart of the beginning of the paper, maybe to the heart of the paper in a sense. But so he's clearly in dialogue with Heidegger, as you point out in the beginning of the paper. But then there's also a clear difference, and it seems that it's the difference between thinking of being and nothing in contradictory terms, right? Yep. So I kind of think of Heidegger, if Hegel ontologizes evil, which I think he does, it seems to me that Heidegger ontologizes irrationality in some fundamental sense, that the irrational kind of has to be a part of the rational in order to keep us from, controlling being or something.
Yeah.
So as you put it, you all we're left with, in a sense, all we encounter is the contradiction, right?
Right.
And Ulrich, of course, wants to avoid that, I think. And that, of course, I'm sure people are like, well, does he? I mean, so right. I mean, right. But it seems to me that the way he does, if he does, is that he has a paradoxical understanding of the relationship between being and nothing, or being something and yet having to get one's subsistence from something else. Balthasar refers to it, and I'm sure he gets this from Ulrich, as the simultaneity of wealth and poverty.
Right.
Yes.
Right. So, and that is more of a paradox. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit. Like, what's the difference between a contradiction and a paradox, maybe?
Yeah.
How does this play out? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so just to orient your listeners a little bit in case they haven't read my article, which I don't blame them if they haven't. But, Heidegger, I mean, one of the reasons I wrote this article is because in grad school, I got really, really interested in Heidegger. And I don't think that's a unique experience. And in fact, like reading Heidegger really helped my thinking and deepened my thought a lot. But at the end, ultimately, it seems to me, at least, or in my experience, I should say, reading Heidegger leaves you a bit empty, no matter what. Like you're like, oh, he's got these really interesting insights, and he wants you to think about being, and he wants you to think about ontology and the metaphysical structure of reality. But then you kind of continue reading Heidegger, and you're like, where are we at here? What is this? Like what? And it's. So the title of my article is "How is it with the nothing?" Ferdinand Ulrich's Thomistic response to Heidegger, and the reason that phrase "How is it with the nothing?" comes from Heidegger has this very famous lecture that ends up in ultimately being like an essay called "What is Metaphysics?" And in "What is Metaphysics?" he asserts that the question of metaphysics is, in German, wie steht das Nichts, or how is it with the nothing, is how it's often translated. Which, of course, you're like, what? Like, that's the central question of metaphysics.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I thought metaphysics, we were talking about, Aristotle says that metaphysics is the study of being qua being, right? And then Heidegger's like, no, the central question of metaphysics is, how is it with the nothing? And not even, what is nothing, right? This kind of very strange articulation of how is it with the nothing. And so, you read it, and Heidegger's always like somewhat mystical and somewhat obscure, but you read it, and it seems to me that what he's getting at is that every being that we encounter has what I call in the article a kind of ungraspability at bottom. That, which is kind of interesting, even in the hard sciences, this like plays out, right? Like, we're still discovering things about like fruit flies, right? And like we're still discovering things about, like subatomic particles and things like every time we think we get to like rock bottom, here is the basic building
Or
block.
more astoundingly, we're still learning things about the human body. Like,
Yeah.
they're still finding new organs in the human body that they didn't know existed,
Yeah, exactly. And so I think if one is honest as a thinker, one sort of sees that your object of study is never exhaustible, right? But I think Heidegger is really, really concerned about people thinking that beings are exhaustible, that we can know everything about them, because that essentially objectifies them, right? I mean,
Yeah.
rather than relating to whatever it is, right? This mug, but it's much worse when we get to kind of animate life, it seems to me, right? Like kind of plants or animals, rather than relating to these things as something that reveals itself to me, right? And therefore, again, like I receive knowledge about it from the thing itself. I think that I understand it completely, right? And therefore, like I can sort of take it in to my intellect, and then I can just move by it, right? That I don't have to kind of, I mean, I know it sounds kind of silly, but like be in awe of the mug. But like as somebody who like does pottery on the side, I am kind of in awe of the mug, actually, right? When you know what goes into it. And so Heidegger's really concerned with us just kind of like, oh yeah, I understand that, move on. I understand that, move on. I understand that, move on. And that does destroy the metaphysical impulse, it seems to me, right? It does, right? If you think you understand something completely and then you can just move on to the next thing or the next object and then consume that as well, right? You're not thinking about being qua being. You're not contemplating things. You're not trying to understand something at its deepest levels. Okay, so then the question is, how does one avoid that? And then what Heidegger proposes, I think, in What is Metaphysics, I'm always hesitant to be super definitive about my interpretations of Heidegger, but I think what Heidegger proposes in that essay or that lecture, What is Metaphysics, is that we have to contemplate the nothing along with being. And then, of course, the question is, well, what's the nothing, right? And he says, well, what we tend to think about the nothing is that we tend to think of like a bunch of beings like in a group, and then we like negate them in our mind, and that like empty space is the nothing, right? But that's already very objectifying, right? Because you've already like put objects in there and then like negated them in thought, like subtracted them or negated them, and then you have like emptiness, and that's the nothing. He's like, no, that's not what the nothing is, right?
Yeah.
He says the nothing is this annihilating. He says the nothing annihilates is how it's often translated, right? So, and that's a neologism, right? Heidegger makes that up. And what does he mean by the nothing annihilates? He means that the nothing, I think, is this force that kind of like shows us that we can't fully understand beings, right? We can't like grasp at them. We can't like exhaust them. And so when the nothing annihilates, what it does is that it sort of, as he puts it, makes beings recede from our grasp, right? And that, so then beings recede from our grasp, and we kind of realize that that's what's happening, and we don't have a full understanding of them, and like the ground that we stand on is not as firm as we thought it was. And then because we're kind of put in this state of, oh no, like I don't understand everything that I thought I did, then beings are given the chance to reveal themselves anew, right? And so there again, you can kind of see the appeal in this, right? That like, oh, so Heidegger says what the nothing does is it induces this state of angst in us, or anxiety is how it's translated a lot of the time in English. And so like what it does is it kind of like, to use kind of layman's terms, it shakes us out of thinking that we know things, right? But the problem as I see it right, is that then the nothing becomes this like force that's almost like sitting behind beings, like pulling them from our grasp, right?
Yeah.
And so the foundation of metaphysics then is not awe or wonder, but like angst, or like anxiety. The foundation of contemplation of metaphysics is us being like, oh no, I don't know anything, actually, right? And so a lot of it has to do with how he understands nothingness. And then the reason I pull Ulrich into it, in addition to the fact that Ulrich himself is referencing Heidegger, is Ulrich also talks about nothingness a lot in his work. But Ulrich says, he doesn't say you have being and the nothing. He says that being is nothing, right? So again, remember, Thomas Aquinas says that being is complete and simple yet non-subsistent, meaning that it doesn't subsist on its own, which means it's nothing in itself. Being is only subsistent in individual beings. So the big question of the article in a lot of ways for me is, what changes for us thinking wise if we view being and nothing, as Heidegger does, almost as two separate things or two separate forces, whereas for Ulrich, being is nothing. So you still have to come to grips with nothingness in a certain way, right? But what changes when we understand being itself is nothing? That, I mean, just to set it up, I could keep going, but just to pause there. So that's the big question.
Well, Jimmy, yeah, that's wonderful. That's a wonderful exposition, Rachel. The thing that kept running through my mind as I was reading the article and reading about, Heidegger's concept of nothing is annihilating and so on is, who does that? And in other words, who is he reacting against? A very wise person once said to me, if you want to really it was Ed Oakes, actually. He said, if you want to understand any great thinker, begin by asking a simple question. What are they afraid of? Which is another way of saying, what is, in his intellectual milieu and context, against what is he reacting? And I'm sitting there thinking, well, who says in the Philosophical Guild, well, we understand that, time to move on? So is he talking then just about the average person's perception of existence, where we believe that we have this utterly perspicacious understanding of, well, yeah, that's a mug, that's a tree, and it's time to move on? Or is he alluding to some kind of philosophical movement that he thinks does want to engage in an overly grasping way at understanding, and then thinking we've encapsulated that, time to move on?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is at least twofold. Number one, I remember Heidegger is writing around the time where technology is rising, right? I mean, he has that essay, The Question Concerning Technology. And so I do think that he's looking around and seeing a kind of what we would now call like a technologization of knowledge, right? That that to know something is just to know how it works, and then you can move on, right? And so that's the first thing I think that he's afraid of, but he lays the fault of that on what he calls, I mean, actually, funnily enough, he ultimately lays the fault of that on Plato, which I mean, it's kind of crazy.
Wow.
Right? I mean, he traces it all the way back to Plato, and he has a real issue with arche, right? He doesn't like saying that anything has like a source or an origin or an arche, right? But then he says it becomes that sort of intellectual movement becomes way more intense in what he calls Roman thinking, by which he means Catholics.
Yeah.
So, and he was in seminary for a while. I write in the article, he almost never ever quotes Thomas Aquinas, but he clearly has Aquinas in mind when he's writing, and he cribs a lot from Aquinas too, without ever saying so. I mean, I refer actually to an article from Betts, where Betts traces that out really nicely. But he says that one of the problems with Roman thinking is thinking that truth is I'm forgetting because I haven't read it in a while, but like ratio, I think, right? Like that truth is like Roman thinking says that truth is the accordance of my idea with the thing itself, right? Mm-hmm. So like I have this idea of a mug, and therefore I see the mug and it fits my idea of mugness, and therefore like it's a true mug, right? And therefore I can move on from that. Versus, I think Heidegger wants, right, to say, no, you can't have like an idea of mug, right? You have to just like let the mug reveal itself to you, right? And so he says that this kind of understanding of truth is anticipatory thinking, that like I already know what a mug is, and therefore I get to judge the truth of whether this thing counts as a mug or not, basically.
Yeah.
Rather than letting the thing itself reveal itself to me. And again, there's something legitimate about that concern, it seems to me, right? That like once I have like an idea of something in my own head, right? And then like whether the thing fits into it or not, right, makes it true, seems to be an opposite understanding of the way human beings should relate to truth, right? Truth gives itself to us. We don't bestow truth on things, right? Okay. Now, the question is whether Heidegger is fair in his interpretations of so-called Roman thinking, right? And I mean, I think often or even Platonic thinking, right? And the answer is often no, I don't think he's fair at all. It's just that I think what he's pointing out is tendencies that worry him, so to speak, but then he pathologizes those tendencies and then responds to them rather than saying, well, wait a second, we have to recover something else here. That's how I would read it.
Very good. Rodney, you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, no, yeah, or a comment maybe, and then maybe a question.
Go ahead.
But it seems that it's I mean, what he's getting at is really important, and we would want to almost ask like what kind of Thomists was he trained by, and one can imagine, right? So so you end up with a kind of what our theological allies would call a dangerously propositional understanding of truth. Like we talk about this in theology with regard to theology of revelation, where you just have to know the propositions, and that exhausts all that has to be said. Getting the words right. So if we say what happens in the celebration of the Eucharist, well, we have transubstantiation. What's that? Well, the substance of the body, the bread and the wine changes into the substance. Oh, okay, we're done. No more to think about, right? We've put it in a proposition. Now we understand exactly what it is. There's no more mystery remaining. And what's kind of interesting to me here is that a lot of people fortunately learned from Heidegger, even though he was kind of an enemy to the Catholic faith in many ways. You see his influence on all of these post-Heideggerian theologians who want to now acknowledge that no, there's the mystery is bottomless. And of course, this goes back to Aquinas himself. And I think you quoted in the footnotes where the thing where Aquinas says you can spend your whole life studying a fly or a flea or whatever it is, and you would never exhaust it. And this is kind of an interesting thing. So this would be a follow-up question then. And you also referenced The Silence of St. Thomas by Pieper in your footnotes too, which is, I love that book so much.
Love that book. So important in my own life.
Good.
Yeah. But so here's a question, because it seems to me that what Pieper's doing there is he's saying, he quotes Aquinas elsewhere as saying, truth always occurs between two intellects, meaning the intellect of God and the intellect of the knower, right? So when I know something, I'm implicitly knowing the idea as it was in God first, right? Because obviously God has the ideas for things before they actually exist in time and space. And we catch a glimpse of that idea in the effects in the actions of a thing, right? And Aquinas also says that we don't ever know the thing in itself in a perfect way. We only know the idea through its accidents, through its actions, et cetera, which is so shocking. It almost sounds like Kant, but you're like, no, Aquinas said that. So that's kind of interesting, something maybe we could talk about. But it seems to me, this is a question I have, that Pieper thinks that the reason for this is there's a surplus of light almost, or a surplus of truth in the thing that we aren't, it's above our pay grade, so to speak. We can never handle all that truth because it's in the mind of God, which is way above us. Whereas it seems to me like Ulrich is kind of taking another angle and saying, well, no, it's not just that. It also has to do with the nothing. And I don't think Pieper does go down that nothing direction. So could you maybe talk about that a little bit? Like, is there a contradiction between, or is there a tension between what Pieper is saying and Ulrich is saying, or is there something new in what Ulrich is saying?
That's a really great question. That was the one that was rattling around in my brain too. So thank you for asking that, Rodney. So go ahead, Rachel. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think that there's a tension. I think it's just a difference in emphasis, essentially. So, yeah, The Silence of St. Thomas is such a great book, and then another thing that I quote in the footnotes is a Gerard Manley Hopkins poem called God's Grandeur, where he says, nature is never spent. There's the dearest freshness deep down things, right? And they're all three of them are getting at, I think, the same reality, just like in different ways, right? And whereas Pieper says that there's this like surplus of light, right? In that way, we could kind of say like a surplus of being, right? So to talk about the fly, so to speak, right? Because the fly's origin is subsistent being itself, right? And to know something is to know its causes. You can never completely know the fly because its origin is infinite, complete, simple, subsistent being. That is God, right? What Ulrich is pointing out, I think in addition, or a sort of slightly different emphasis, right, is that if God creates through essay, the complete and simple yet non-subsistent essay, right? Then in addition, like that, what God is doing in creating this way, like through essay that's complete and simple yet non-subsistent, God's giving sort of like two things, so to speak. And that's like the wrong way to put it, but in metaphysics, your language kind of always fails you, right? On the one hand, God is giving being, right? And really giving it all, like it's complete and simple. But he's also giving the non-subsistence of being, right? This isn't a us not being everything, right? Is not a result of the fall or a problem of sin, right? That is the gift, right? Because like if we were everything, we'd just be God. We'd just be an appendage of God. To not be God is the gift, actually.
That's right.
Right? To not be God is to be, actually. And so the non-subsistence or the nothingness of being, right? That's what Ulrich is highlighting, right? Is that we're not just connected to God in the sense of like the overflow or surplus of being, right? We're also ourselves, right? And the nothingness of being is precisely what allows us to be ourselves in a certain way, right? That's what Ulrich is pointing out, right? Because, right, you've got God who is complete and simple subsistent being. And then you've got created being, which is complete and simple non-subsistent, right? And the only way created being is not God, is not completely, is its non-subsistence, actually. So one of the things that Ulrich is pointing out is the seeming nothingness, which again, we could grow, and in fact do grow very resentful of, right? I mean, this is the original sin, right? Is to grow resentful of our own creatureliness, right? That nothingness, so to speak, right? That being is nothing in itself is the gift of being, right? Is the gift of being. And so to know anything at all, right, is and to know it in itself and not just as like, like spermaticoi of God or extension of God or something like that. To know anything at all is a result of this non-subsistence of created being.
Yeah.
Does that answer the question?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it raises another one in my mind, which is to quote Bishop Barron, since his name has already been brought up. Barron, and Rodney's in my book, How Balthasar Changed My Mind. Barron actually had a great chapter on Balthasar. I can't remember the exact title of it, but in that chapter, he makes the point, other people have made it too, but he really has made it his own, that the relationship of creation to God is non-competitive. That it's a that God's transcendence is a non-competitive transcendence. Therefore, to bring it back to Ulrich and what we're talking about here, yes, our being is non-subsistent. In that sense, we're not God. Nevertheless, and that's sort of a kind of nothing, uh, which means that even our being is non-subsistent, which means for us to have being, we have to, in some sense, participate in the divine being, which means that our non-subsistent being gifted being in of itself is not a posture of independence from God. So I was wondering, what is Ulrich's approach then to the question of analogy and how we participate in the divine being? How creatures actually, how the non-subsistent being participates in subsistent being?
Yeah, this is something I feel like one of the next things I need to really dig into is, specifically analogy in Ulrich. Like I don't know if I can say too much.
Okay, well, that's fine.
Well, no. Let me answer. I just want to make sure that I'm like, people know I'm extrapolating here. But the first article I ever wrote on Ulrich, it's in Communio, not to be too self-promoty here, but it's called.
Hey, we're pushing New Ressourcement. We should push Communio as well.
It's called Thinking the Nothing of Being, Ferdinand Ulrich on trans-nihilation. So again, bringing it back to Heidegger says that this that the nothing annihilates beings, right? And then Ulrich also invents a neologism, and I think pretty clearly has to do with Heidegger. He's like responding to Heidegger. And so instead of saying that that there's a Nichten, which is the annihilation, that being or nothing annihilates, Ulrich uses this word Durchnichten or Durchnichtung, right, which is translated trans-nihilation. So the nothing annihilates, and then being trans-nihilates, according to Ulrich. Durch in German means like through, right? Yep. And so you can almost say like that when being sort of gives itself over to beings, right? Again, it gives being, right? Like it allows beings to be, but it also gives this, as I call it, a mark of non-subsistence, right? And so the trans-nihilation is this sort of communication of being's nothingness to individual beings. Why do I bring this up? Because Ulrich is often saying that being, I like counted this throughout Homo Abyssus for that article, but like being, he says oftentimes being is nichts anders, nothing other than, right? And it's precisely because Thomas makes very clear that esse is not just like a concept, right? It's real. It doesn't exist in itself, but being is real. And so what Ulrich proposes is that because God creates through being, right, it allows him to be the intimately other. It allows God to be the intimately other to us. So being gives us our being, but like it allows God to sort of be the non-competitive, right? That he, as Augustine says, he's closer to us than right we are to ourselves. And so because otherwise, to do a kind of oversimple counterfactual, right? If God was just like parceling out bits of his own being, because I think sometimes when we hear this word participation, right, that's what we think. Like if God was like parceling out bits of his own being to give to us, then we would be in competition with him, and then he couldn't be kind of more intimate to us than we are to ourselves. But because he creates through being, right? And being is not like a third thing between us and the world, right? Because it doesn't exist in itself, but because he creates through being, he can be in us, right? In a non-competitive way. And that's what I think. That's why I think that Ulrich thinks that this understanding of being is nothing is so, so important, precisely for that reason, Larry, that there's not this competition between creatures and their creator.
The reason why I asked the question, and Rodney, you can jump in a second, is because I've been reading David Hart and watching some of his videos, and there was a famous conversation he had with John Milbank, in which Hart was chiding Milbank and us communio types, us Lubacian types, for wallowing in paradox too much, and sort of stretching paradox to the point of the absurd. And it just seems to me in reading Hart, and then of course others in a similar vein, there's an increasing movement towards almost a kind of monistic understanding of the God-world relationship. That Hart has now taken the nature-grace dynamic and essentially done away with it on the grounds that nature is already grace. It's not always already in grace, but nature is grace. And so that's why I asked the question about the nature of our participation and the relationship to analogy. That was the gist of it. Rodney, go ahead.
No, that's really, I think, important stuff. And I do think there's, I'm kind of working on this right now. I'm working on a chapter for a book on predestination and free will and all these questions, and I'm dealing with Hart. So but these metaphysical roots are really important to that debate, I think. And I think it's absolutely, Hart is smart enough to know that if he's going to have the almost quasi-determinist notion of infinite and finite freedom that he has.
I don't mean to disparage Hart. I mean, I'm probably a cartoonish take on him, but it just seems. Go ahead.
No, all I'm saying is that he's smart enough to know that if he's going to take this very, very radical stance on the relationship between infinite and finite freedom that he does, he's going to also have to pave the way metaphysically to do so by saying things like there's no distinction between emanation and creation, or there's no difference between, et cetera, et cetera. So you're on to something, I think, that's very, very important. And this kind of gets to another question, I think. I think this is related. So Rachel, this is for you. You say at some point that the nothing, therefore, is not simply a negative thing, if you could put it that way, that it's a perfection of being, that the fact that it's non-subsistent, et cetera, is a perfection of being. Now, if we think about the analogy of being, you can articulate it in a million different ways, but one way to articulate it is to say there is no goodness found in creation that is not preeminently found in God, right? So that's one way of articulating it, I think. Is there nothing in God?
Oh my gosh, this is really funny. I have a friend who's at BC right now. His name is Father Rob von Alstein, and he's working on Ulrich. And I mean, he literally came out before Christmas we had lunch, and he kind of asked the same question and then told me my point is nonsense, because he was like, there can't be nothingness in God. And I was like, well, wait a second.
Yeah. Well,
he's like, how could you say that? Precisely for the reasons you just laid out, Rodney. Like, how can you say nothingness is a perfection, right? Because then you would have to say it's in God somehow. So anyway, we had a long discussion about it. I think yes, although we have to be very careful about what we mean by that, right? But I mean, one of the things I asked him was, is it good that the Father is not the Son, and that the Son is not the Spirit, right? Like, I think we have to say yes to that, right? I mean, we have to say yes to that. Well, if we have to say yes that it is good that the Father is not the Son and the Son is not the Spirit, then there has to be something, right? Again, very sort of carefully qualified, but something like a nothingness in God, or a negation, or negativity, however you want to put it, in God, right? That the Father is not the Son, that the Son's not the Spirit, right? if that's a good thing, it seems to me that's precisely what gives us license to say that it's a good thing that created being is not God, right? That's what grounds our affirmation of created being, right? Is the original affirmation of the difference between the persons, it seems to me.
Yeah, I think a hint at the answer in some ways, Rodney already alluded to it very early on in our conversation in talking about how in Balthasar there is the coinciding of wealth and poverty. I was reading John Betts's great new book on the Christ, the Logos of Creation. John Betts, in my mind, is just one of the most brilliant guys out there right now. I'm just going to say that. I love Betts. And he's a very humble guy on top of it all. Great guy. But anyway, there's a great chapter. Margaret Turk pointed it out to me. And so it was the first chapter in his book that I read. It was on the humility of God. And he points out in there's a great debate between Balthasarians and Thomists, whereas the Balthasarians say, of course, there can be humility in God, and it's linked to the concept of kenosis and Balthasar's notion of urkenosis within the Godhead. Whereas the Thomists come along and say, just following Aquinas's very basic definition of humility as almost a master-slave kind of thing. No, there can't be humility in God because that implies that God is humbling himself to something higher. So by definition, God can't be humble. And so the Thomists say, see, this shows Balthasar is interjecting some kind of Gnostic nothingness into God and some sort of darkness into God and so on. But obviously, I come down on the Balthasarian side. So does John Betts. It seems to me that the economy of salvation is called into question by that Thomistic distinction, because everything in the Gospels, everything, and Balthasar makes this very clear, makes it very, in the economy of salvation is about kenosis, is about that divestment as, in some say, investment. And I just don't think there's any way around that. Anyway, I'm not really asking a question, just making a comment, but maybe if you wanted to say something to that.
Yeah, I think this is part of the reason I wrote the article. When Ulrich says nothingness, he does not mean a thing, right? And
Yep.
I think sometimes when we think about nothingness, again, we do what Heidegger's afraid or warns us from against doing, which is we like make a thing in our head, right? And then like we call that the nothing, right? Like it's almost like a black hole or something. I don't know, right? And I mean, it's hard not to. We are material creatures that like think in concepts that represent like things that we encounter, right? So it's really, when we say nothing, it's really hard not to have like an image of like a black hole or whatever, right?
Or just empty space. That's
Yeah.
what most people think of nothingness is take everything that's universe in the universe, get rid of it all. And so it's like a room without any furniture. That's all.
Yeah,
But all knowledge comes through the senses. That's Thomistic. So it's hard
exactly.
for us. We conceive the
Right.
concept of nothing.
Exactly. And so I think when we get in, I mean, we are way beyond my area of expertise here when we're talking about the
Mine
Trinity. I
too,
just
Ray.
need to be very clear about that. But
Yeah.
but I do think that whenever we get into these discussions about God and like a kind of nothingness in God or like a humility in God, we are thinking very like objectifyingly, if that makes sense. I was going to say objectively, but that has a different connotation, right? But like we think of like putting like the black hole or the empty space in God, and that's what we're thinking, right? Rather, and like this is what Ulrich says, that Heidegger, funnily enough, like even though the Heidegger kind of wants to think the nothing well, what Ulrich says is he doesn't think nothingness radically enough. I mean, that's quite the accusation, right? For the guy who says that metaphysics is actually thinking about this question of how is it with the nothing, right? And so then the question is like, what does Ulrich mean by Heidegger not thinking the nothing radically enough? Well, it seems to me that he's essentially accusing Heidegger of thinking nothingness as like a thing, right? Or at least like a force or something, right? Whereas, I mean, it's actually right nothing, like it's
Right.
actually,
Yeah.
right? And so, and then again, I know that is hard to conceive, but when we sort of translate that conversation into the Trinitarian relations, again, we're not talking about like sticking a black hole in God or like sticking negativity in God or we're talking about there being a goodness in an otherness. Maybe that would sort of like appease
Yeah.
people's
Yeah.
fears a little bit more or assuage
Yeah.
people's fears that it's good not to be someone or something else, right? And so the goodness and otherness is what it seems to me, at least for Ulrich, nothingness really saves for us or assures for us is maybe a better way to put it.
Wow.
Can I follow? Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, that's really good stuff. So it seems to me then, therefore, that Ulrich's concept of being is quote, quote big enough to make room for that. Whereas it
Yes.
seems to me that Heidegger is still needs something to oppose being almost.
Yes.
Right. It's like he's afraid that if there's nothing to oppose being, then we're gonna grab it and turn it all into technology or something.
Yeah.
Like that, right. Whereas I think what Ulrich is saying was within being itself, there's richness and poverty. Right.
Yes.
So
yes.
Just a comment, and maybe this will lead to another question, but yeah, one of the dangers of thinking about analogy and this is where I think a certain kind of Thomism gets into trouble because it sort of starts working out these problems of the one and the many, God and the world, and all that stuff, without yet invoking the Trinity. Right? We're thinking of the God of the philosophers, and then we're working out all these like, what does the analogy look like? What's the via negativa look like, et cetera, et cetera.
By the way, I'm going to interrupt real quick. That's
Yeah.
Betz's point, his critique of the Thomist understanding of humility, that it's beginning with an understanding of simply the God of the philosophers, and that
Yes.
God cannot have humility,
Yes.
whereas the Trinitarian God can. So go ahead.
That's exactly the point I'm going to make, right? So in other words, if you, and this is what makes Ulrich's refusal to kind of radically separate philosophy and theology super helpful, right? It's as if these things that he kind of knows as a believing Christian, you can't kind of pretend you can't unknow them, right? There's something there that's worth thinking about that maybe you wouldn't have thought about if you hadn't known it through revelation. But now that you know it through revelation, that doesn't mean you can't think about it philosophically, right? That's kind of what's going on, it seems to me. But so if it's good that I'm not Rachel and I'm not Larry, right? If you're going to do this in a kind of Buddhistic or a strictly non-dualist Hindu way, that would be precisely part of the problem that would have to be gotten rid of if we're going to ascend to God. In our ascent to God, that would have to be obliterated. And we all have to realize that Atman is Brahman. So we're all Brahman and we're not actually different. And I do, to go back to Hart, and my point is not just to pick on Hart, who's not here to defend himself, but it does seem that he almost needs that concept of the God-world relationship to do what he wants to do with infinite and finite freedom. And that's precisely why Balthasar balks at the notion that we can just declare that God is automatically going to save everyone. Because Balthasar really does think that there's something good about the fact that my freedom is not God's freedom. Exactly. And he is a participation in it. I mean, he's not a naive, all of that stuff. And I think that's important. I mean, Ratzinger says somewhere, the only thing that God does not own is your yes.
Right.
And that's a beautiful way of capturing the respect that God has for that otherness between us and him. So that's just some.
Yeah, that's interesting. Danny, when I interviewed Danny Drain a few years ago now, maybe a year or two ago, we were talking about universalism. We were talking about hell and the possibility of damnation. And he made a very interesting point with regard to Balthasar. And that is that if hell represents simply distance from God, or in some sense, a moving away from God, he says there's already something analogous to that within God himself. Yeah. And that's that struck me like a thunderbolt.
Yeah.
I thought that was extreme and real. I don't have the wherewithal to unpack it all right now, but I think there's really something to that. And it relates to what you were just talking about, Howsare.
Yeah.
Can I just, I mean, metaphysics is, I know a lot of people think it's really abstract and, dense and things like that. But if you don't mind, Larry, I would love to just like sort of show that there's like concrete consequences to how we think about
Absolutely.
these
That was
things.
actually going to be my next question.
Yeah.
What is the cash value of all of this?
Yeah, there we go. I like that.
Not much.
Yes, my paychecks affirms that. So
everybody should go read David C. Schindler's article on money from like years and years
oh
ago.
yeah,
on
it's so
Plato
good.
and stuff. Yeah,
My
that was
Socrates
really good.
didn't charge. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I don't know when it will be translated, but there's a book called Ulrich wrote a book called Gift and Gabe und Vergebung, so gift and like forgiveness essentially. And what it is actually like a 600-page meditation on the parable of the prodigal son. And it's funny, every time you turn the page you're like, surely he's exhausted this, and then all of a sudden and then he
Yeah.
and then all of a sudden you're like, no, he hasn't, and this is amazing. Like, it never gets less profound. But one of the things he shows there is he talks about each of the sons' relationship to the father as a kind of way to think about, like, thinking about the creature's relationship to the creator, or how the creature conceives of his own relationship to the creator, right? And so the son who stays home thinks about his like the way that Ulrich interprets this is that he thinks about his like this is the person who thinks about his relationship to the creator as like essentially just being an extension thereof, right? And so at first you just think like, well, because I'm an extension thereof, then I deserve like X, Y, and Z, right? You don't have your own freedom, right? But then you grow bitter when your creator actually treats you like you have your own freedom, because you actually do, right? Right? And then you have this kind of bitter relationship to your creator, right? So at first you think you're being like loyal by thinking you're just an extension thereof, right? But then the way that bears out is you're not being loyal. You're actually being really resentful of your creator, because you want him to make your decisions for you, and you want him to like do everything for you, right? You don't appreciate the gift that you were actually given of your own existence, right? Does that make sense? So
Perfect.
then the son who goes away, the prodigal son, right? He represents somebody who wants to just like reject his creator completely, right? Obvious. I mean, that's a little bit more obvious, right? Reject the fact that he has a source and has an origin, right? But then, so he, in some sense, it looks like he's embracing the freedom that he's been given. But the problem with that is that he doesn't, he's not recognizing that it's a freedom that's been given, right? And so because he doesn't recognize that it's a freedom that's been given, it just goes completely awry, and it totally like perverts itself, actually. The reason I bring this up is because this actually has to do with how we understand being, right? And like how we understand the kind of nothingness of our being, right? If on the one hand, we understand the nothingness as I was saying before, the gift itself, right? To be not God is a good thing, right? It puts us, I mean, as much as being in a fallen state can, right? It puts us in this disposition to actually like receive from God, realize he's our source, and actually be free in that, right?
Yeah.
But if we either reject God, or if we think that he actually hasn't given us our own freedom, right? Which is like the son who stays home, right? So we either reject God, or we think he hasn't given us our freedom. If we view the nothingness of our own being as a weight or a burden and not the gift itself, right? We end up having this like either completely how do I want to put it? This completely almost codependent relationship on God, not a dependent relationship, but a codependent, like, you need to make my decisions for me. You need to do this for me. or we reject him completely, right? And then that goes awry as well. And then this type of, and again, we don't all have like a perfectly articulated conscious metaphysical systems, but it is the case that we like view our lives in a certain way, and we view our freedom as like a burden or a gift, right? And we view our origin, right, as something to be grateful for or something to be resentful of. And that tends to sort of come out in how we treat people and other things, right? And our own lives, how we view our own lives. So I just wanted to say that, like, again, like I'm just I know the accusation of metaphysics is often that, like, what does this have to do with anything? Like, why are we talking about being and form and everything like that? But as Thomas writes and Ulrich quotes right at the beginning of Homo Abyssus, this small mistake in the beginning could end up essentially defining your entire like view of life. And that's why Ulrich like spends so much time on getting this stuff right. And I mean, at least as far as he understands it.
No, thank you for that, Rachel, because I think it's an extremely important point in our anti-metaphysical age, in our age still characterized by, or maybe even increasingly so, a resurgent positivism, a resurgent scientism, the technocratic paradigm, the reduction of everything to a flatlined materialism, with sort of Deus ex machina, ghost in the machine, sort of whistling past the graveyard spiritualities of, I hope there's an afterlife. Maybe my soul will float out of me like Tinkerbell when I die and go off to Disney World in the sky, and I'll be happy, Paradise Park. That's characterized. So it's very important. That's why I think Balthasar said that, in the modern world, Christianity is going to have to be the guardian of metaphysics.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And because like once that's gone and once the recognition of its importance is gone, you're essentially saying that everything is surface, right? And and when you say that everything is surface, what you're saying is that appearance doesn't reveal anything. And that's not a world I want to live in.
Yeah, that was always a huge theme of David L. Schindler's as well, right?
Yes.
The epiphanic nature of everything. And what we're doing is we're just sweeping the appearance away. It reminds me again of Balthasar in the very first volume of the Aesthetics. I think page 13 in the English translation is, in a world where beauty is denied,
exactly,
goodness and truth soon follow.
Exactly.
In their train. Anyway, Rodney, do you have something that you want to add to this?
I don't think so. All of my questions that I wanted to ask, I did, and what a great conversation. I mean, that's such good stuff, Rich.
Rachel, you went and got yourself edumacated, I have to say.
Somebody undid all the damage that we did to her, Larry.
Yeah. All the day I threw that eraser at you and missed and hit somebody else instead. Yeah, in the class, it was an eraser, right?
Yeah, I mean, you did much worse to me in class, but that's the podcast level one that we can tell.
Yeah, I called you a few names and
Indeed,
all kinds of stuff. But all joking aside, I think the same way about right now former students of ours like Danny Drain, Matt Cooner, and some others. You guys have just made us proud. Really, really, you are at the top of your game. This was just, the article is brilliant. Your previous article, Comunio, is brilliant. You're doing great work, and so keep it up.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's the paternal avuncular side of me saying, I'm proud of you, girl. Proud of you.
It comes out occasionally.
Yeah, once in a while. All joking aside, yeah, I'm quite proud of the intellect that you have become. Anyway, and thanks, Rodney. Thank you, Rodney, for showing up today.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Eventually, you and I are going to do another podcast on Vatican II, and we're going to talk about Dignitatis Humanae. Woo! The big one. Yeah, the one that all the trads hate. So we'll go from there. So anyway, thank you, Rachel, again, Dr. Coleman, for coming on. Thank you, Rodney. And thanks, everybody, for listening. Until we meet again, folks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.